They laughed when homeless veteran walked in the gun store. 1 hour later, they stood frozen. The moment Miles Tannen, a homeless veteran, stepped into Jackson County Firearms, the room fell into a quiet buzz, followed quickly by scoffs and whispered doubts. No one expected much from the man with weathered clothes and guarded eyes. What they didn't know was that Miles carried a legacy forged in covert operations and silent sacrifices few could comprehend. Beneath his worn exterior lay the precision of a Navy SEAL whose skills had saved lives and shattered enemies, all while living in the shadows of a society that had forgotten him. As skeptical eyes watched him browse the aisles, they were unaware that in less than an hour, their mocking laughter would freeze, replaced by stunned silence, when a quiet demonstration would reveal the true weight of a soldier's untold story and demand the respect he had long been denied. And before I forget, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. The bell above the glass door jingled, but no one really looked up. Not at first. The midday sun spilled through the front window of Jackson County Firearms, glinting off polished barrels and hanging scopes. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Behind the counter, 3 employees laughed about some clip from a tactical show on TV, mugs of cheap gas station coffee steaming in front of them. That's when he walked in. An older man, maybe mid-60s. His beard was untrimmed but clean, hair gray and tied back loosely. Wore a battered canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, the kind that had seen 1,000 miles of cold. His jeans were stained and frayed at the cuffs, and his boots, well, they weren't boots. They were combat-issued, but long since worn down to cracked leather and memory. In one hand, he carried an old army green duffel bag, the zipper half broken, held together with paracord. In the other, a folded paper with faint creases and faded ink. A flyer, maybe. He paused just past the threshold and took in the store. No one greeted him. The man behind the counter, tall and built like a former linebacker, gave a look to his co-worker that said, "Another one." "Stores cash only on weekends," he called out. The old man nodded, said nothing, just stepped further in. 2 younger customers near the ammo aisle snickered when he passed. One nudged the other and muttered something about tactical cosplay for the homeless. The other chuckled, loud enough to carry. The old man kept walking, slow but purposeful, straight toward the back wall, the one lined with rifles. He paused in front of a vintage bolt-action, its walnut stock gleaming with fresh polish, then shifted his eyes to the shelf beneath it and to the XM 2010 sniper system resting in a locked case, matte black, pristine. Army issue. Not for sale unless you really knew someone. Behind the counter, the clerk noticed. "You know what you're looking at?" he asked, half amused. The man didn't answer. He just studied the gun, head tilted slightly, eyes quiet, but intense, like he wasn't just looking at the rifle, but through it. "I said." The clerk repeated louder, "That's not a display for rent." The old man looked up, finally. His voice was calm. Sandpaper and smoke. No one rents a precision instrument. The air shifted. Barely, but enough. "Right?" The clerk muttered, covering his smirk. "Well, if you're just browsing, try not to breathe on the glass too much." One of the young men walked up behind the veteran, standing too close. "You shoot, old man." The veteran's gaze didn't move, but his fingers, steady and deliberate, reached into his duffel and removed a long, narrow metal cylinder. He placed it on the counter with a gentle clink. It was a suppressor, custom machined, worn but spotless. Then he opened the duffel, just slightly. Inside, not trash, not rags, but gear. Military grade. Folded tight. Wrapped clean. A journal. A faded patch. A laminated ID card from a different time. One word at the top. Redacted. Still, no one noticed. Not yet. But that hour was coming. And the laughter, it wouldn't last. The silence stretched for a moment too long. The suppressor sat on the counter like a dropped confession. The clerk, suddenly aware of the customers watching, tried to steer the tone back into sarcasm. He leaned forward, pointing at the cylinder. "That thing's not street legal unless you're on a list I haven't seen." The old man didn't blink. Instead, he reached into the canvas duffel again and removed a small case. He clicked it open, not theatrically, just habit, and revealed a perfectly preserved Form 4. Government issued. Notarized. Dated 20 years back. Stamped approved. The clerk leaned in and his brow furrowed. The stamp was real. The signature matched something deep in the government system. Below the signature, the registered name. Miles H. Tannen. Another shift in the room. The name didn't ring bells. Not yet. But the authority of that stamp, the sheer formality of it, was enough to crack the smirk off the clerk's face. Okay, he said slowly. So you've got some paperwork. The older man didn't reply. He simply reached for the XM 2010 locked behind the glass. The other employee, a younger guy in a fitted tactical hoodie, scoffed. That's a $12,000 rifle. You sure you don't want to browse the second-hand ARs instead, Gramps? Another laugh from the back aisle. But something about the man's hand, the way his fingers hovered above the display, the measured breath he took, caught the attention of one person in the room. A teenage girl, maybe 16, stood with her father near the counter. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't laugh. Instead, she watched the old man's posture, the balance in his stance, the slight turn of the shoulders, the way his weight adjusted as if a weapon were already in his hands. Her father looked down at her. What is it? She didn't answer, because she was remembering a photo her grandfather had shown her once, a newspaper clipping, yellowed with time. A black and white image of a sniper kneeling in the rubble of an Afghan compound. No name, no face, just a silhouette and the caption. Ghost marksman ends siege with single shot. The same stance, the same angle of shoulders. The girl looked up. Her eyes widened. And across the store, Miles Tannen whispered softly, mostly to himself. Wind steady. 6 knots. Quartering head on. 2 MOA left. The clerk blinked. What? But the old man wasn't looking at him. He was staring past the display, toward the back wall where a digital precision shooting simulator was set up. One of those expensive training rigs most customers ignored. He walked past the counter. Quiet. Deliberate. One of the young customers called out. Hey, you planning on buying something or just playing G.I. Joe today? No response. Miles Tannen knelt beside the simulator, the duffel at his feet, the suppressor in one hand. And that same calm voice again. I'll need .300 Win Mag. 5 rounds. And 30 seconds. The clerk laughed again, nervous this time. You think this is some kind of game? Miles looked up. No, he said. I think it's a memory. And when he stood, the air in the room began to thicken. Because someone, finally, was starting to remember something too. The digital shooting simulator was tucked into the far corner of the shop, mostly untouched. It was more for show, a marketing gimmick, really, and rarely used except by weekend hobbyists trying to impress dates or Instagram followers. But when Miles Tannen approached it, something shifted. He didn't fumble with the controls, didn't ask questions. He simply moved like someone who had trained others to do this. Years ago, in places most people didn't return from. He adjusted the scope with the precision of a surgeon. Not fast, not flashy, just right. Sir. The teenage girl's voice was cautious now, barely above a whisper as she stepped closer to the counter. What did he say about MOA? Her father furrowed his brow. Minute of angle. It's shooter talk. The clerk tried to brush her off. It's just jargon. He probably picked it up from YouTube or something. But her gaze stayed locked on the man by the simulator. He's not playing, she said softly. Behind the counter, the younger employee leaned toward the computer terminal, trying to pull up the federal background check system. He typed the name, Miles H. Tannen. A red bar flashed. Clearance level. Restricted. Authorization required. What the hell, he muttered. He hit refresh. Same result. Then, a quiet voice behind him. You'll want to stop poking around. It belonged to a man in his late 40s, stocky, clean-shaven, wearing plain clothes, but carrying himself like a Marine who never really retired. He had entered quietly, unnoticed. Now he stood beside the suppressor on the counter, gently turning it with one finger. The younger clerk stiffened. Can I help you? The man didn't answer. He was looking past him now, at Miles, adjusting the simulator's settings. He asked for 5 rounds of .300 Win Mag, the man said. You should give it to him. Who are you? The clerk asked, unsettled. He held up a leather wallet. Inside, a Department of Defense contractor ID. The name wasn't what mattered. The unit patch on the corner was. It was a black trident over a lightning bolt. No words. No motto. Just the kind of insignia you didn't find on Google. The clerk blinked. The contractor leaned closer. You know why it says restricted next to that name? He said quietly. Because he made it that way. People like him don't end up in the system. They design the system. They're ghosts with rifles. And that man, that ghost, kept a lot of kids alive before most of this store's customers were born. The clerk didn't speak. The contractor looked at him once more. Get him the rounds. And without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked toward the simulator, slow, respectful, like approaching an altar. Back at the far wall, Miles Tannen finished adjusting the stock. He checked the windage one last time. Even though the simulation was digital, he didn't trust simulations. But muscle memory didn't ask for trust, only precision. The girl near the counter whispered again. He's not just a shooter. Her father looked at her. Then what is he? And she replied, almost reverently. He's someone they used to call when things went wrong. The box of .300 Win Mag rounds slid across the counter with a soft scrape. The contractor had handed it over himself. No more smirks. No more chuckles. Just silence, thick as oil. Miles Tannen accepted the box with a nod. No words. He opened it slowly. Inspected each round like they were old friends. Not a ceremonial gesture. A ritual of respect. Thumbed the brass. Checked the primers. Confirmed the grain weight by feel. Back in the day, that level of care had made the difference between a hostage going home or not. He loaded the rounds into the simulator's mock magazine, methodical. No wasted movement. No hesitation. From the far corner, a new voice chimed in. Loud. Uninvited. Bet he still misses. This thing's got a lag, a guy in tactical sneakers said, crossing his arms. I used it last week. It's crap. The girl turned to look at him. So did her father. So did the contractor. No one replied. Because Miles was already prone. He lay flat, elbows out, breathing slow. The kind of stillness that made people uneasy, because it was too still. Not lazy, not stiff. Just efficient. Like the space he occupied had shrunk down to a single perfect circle, the trigger guard. The simulation flickered to life on the screen before him. A digital valley, targets lined at increasing distances, 300 to 1,500 yards. Wind variables, light distortion, terrain simulation. The kind of setup usually run at military expos or high-end training facilities. He dialed the scope once. Exhaled. Crack. The digital rifle fired. No dramatic music. Just the soft simulated report and the screen blinking. 300 yards, center Massachusetts bullseye. No one breathed. Another breath. Another round. Crack. 700 yards, headshot. Wind offset adjusted. Behind him, the sarcasm in the room started to evaporate like steam on desert stone. Crack. 1,000 yards, lateral drift compensated. Target down. Now people moved closer. Not to interrupt, just to witness. As if something sacred was taking place in the corner of a gun shop that hours ago had meant nothing more than weekend ammo discounts. The contractor folded his arms, watching with a slight nod. He's running wind calculations from feel, he murmured. That's not just training. That's time. That's years behind glass, breathing with the earth. Crack. 1,200 yards, high-angle shot. One round elimination. And finally, the last round. A target simulated at 1,500 yards, through environmental distortion, elevation shift, and simulated sand haze. Most shooters never even attempted it. But Miles blinked slowly, measured his breath. His finger curled. Crack. 1,500 yards, confirmed kill. Max range achieved. Silence. Then a beep. The simulator shut off. On the screen, 5 clean hits. No misses. Margin of error, .02 MOA. The clerk dropped his coffee cup. No one noticed. Miles rose slowly, gathered the spent rounds, placed them into the small bag with the same reverence he had begun with. Then he looked around for the first time, not just with his eyes, but with presence. And in that moment, no one in the store saw a homeless man anymore. They saw a weapon, one that had chosen to survive peace as carefully as he once survived war. The teenage girl stepped forward, wide-eyed. "Sir, was that real?" Miles looked at her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "It always is. You just stop needing people to believe it." The heavy silence that had settled over Jackson County Firearms felt like the pause between gunshots, tense, expectant, and thick with unspoken truths. Miles Tannen lifted his worn canvas sleeve slowly, the fabric catching on a rough scar that ran beneath it. The scar itself was faded, but the ink beneath told a different story. His arm revealed a tattoo, not flashy or decorative, but deliberate and symbolic. A black trident entwined with jagged lightning bolts, inked with precision that spoke of solemn purpose, not art for art's sake. The insignia was a ghost, the mark of an elite unit shrouded in secrecy, one whispered about by those who knew, yet never openly discussed. A symbol that carried weight far beyond the ink itself. The clerk behind the counter caught the tattoo out of the corner of his eye. His fingers faltered on the keyboard. The younger employee near the cash register stopped mid-sip of his coffee, his eyes widening involuntarily. Even the teenagers who had been mocking Miles just an hour ago now looked with a mix of curiosity and hesitation, unsure how to process the shift in atmosphere. The teenage girl who had been standing quietly by the counter gasped softly, drawing her father's attention. His face stiffened, the lines of years and care deepening as he stared at the tattoo. "Is that real?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with disbelief. Miles didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drop to the floor as memories flickered behind his eyes, shadows of a past that few could understand. Flashback. The desert was alive with distant echoes of gunfire, the heat of the day giving way to cold nights under a shattered sky. A younger Miles crouched behind the rubble of a ruined building, his hands steady but his breath uneven. Under the faint glow of a flashlight, he traced the same trident and lightning emblem on his arm with trembling fingers, a silent promise carved into his skin. It was more than a tattoo. It was a vow to survive, to protect, and to carry the burden of those who could not carry themselves. That night, somewhere between explosions and whispered orders, the mark was sealed into his flesh, a permanent reminder of a life lived in shadows, in service, and in sacrifice. Back to the present. Miles exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You don't get this kind of mark without earning it," he said quietly, his voice steady but thick with the weight of unspoken history. A low murmur rippled through the room, a collective breath drawn by those beginning to understand. Whispers of respect replacing the earlier derision. From the back of the store, a voice broke through the charged atmosphere. It was calm, but carried the weight of shared history. "Miles, they told me you were gone." All heads turned toward the speaker. An older man stepped forward, his jacket dusted with the same black, trident patch stitched carefully on the shoulder. His eyes were hard yet warm, etched with years of battle, loss, and brotherhood. He looked at Miles not with surprise, but with a recognition deeper than words. Miles met his gaze and nodded slowly. "I was just hiding," he replied softly. The room seemed to shift again. The skepticism of the clerk, the arrogance of the younger customers, even the cautious awe of the teenage girl, all dissolved in the presence of a reunion that needed no fanfare. Miles looked around the store one last time. Then, with quiet dignity, he touched the tattoo lightly. "I don't need a gun to remind you who I am. This," he said, voice low but firm, "tells the story." A long moment passed, thick with unspoken memories and hard-won truths, before the contractor from earlier stepped forward, his voice a whisper but filled with reverence. "Stories like his don't end in silence," he said. The words hung in the air as if sealing a pact, a recognition that some legacies are carried not in headlines or medals, but in the quiet strength of those who walk among us, unseen yet unbroken. The air inside Jackson County Firearms had shifted completely. The earlier skepticism and whispered doubts were replaced by a heavy, respectful silence that hung like a sacred veil over everyone in the room. Miles Tannen stood calm, his figure steady despite the years etched in his weathered face and hands. Gone was the image of a homeless man. Instead, he carried the quiet authority of someone who had borne burdens far greater than any here could imagine. His presence filled the room without a word, commanding attention simply by existing. From the back of the store, the older man with the same black, trident patch stepped forward. His eyes, sharp yet softened by time and memory, fixed on Miles with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Miles," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we thought you were gone. We've been waiting." Miles met his gaze, a flicker of old pain and understanding passing between them. "I was hiding, but not for long," he replied quietly, voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken stories. The teenage girl, standing close to her father, looked up with wide eyes shimmering in a new light. "Dad," she whispered, "that man, he's a hero." Her father nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat, unable to find words that did justice to the moment. Behind the counter, the clerk and the contractor exchanged looks, a silent acknowledgement that they had misjudged the man in front of them. This wasn't just some drifter or relic. This was a man whose story was written in blood and silence, a living testament to sacrifice and endurance. Miles reached into his worn duffel and carefully withdrew a small, weathered photograph. He handed it to the older man, who examined it with a soft smile. The photo was a faded snapshot of younger soldiers around a campfire, their faces lit by flickering flames. Among them was a young Miles, fierce, determined, and very much alive. The clerk cleared his throat, breaking the hush. "Sir, I'm sorry we doubted you." Miles inclined his head, his expression humble but firm. "Respect isn't given. It's earned, and sometimes it's forgotten." As he packed away his gear, the room held its breath. He looked slowly around the store, meeting eyes now filled with respect, wonder, and quiet reverence. Without another word, Miles turned and walked toward the door. The bell chimed softly above him as he stepped outside. The fading light of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. The contractor followed quietly and placed a steady hand on Miles's shoulder. "You're not invisible anymore," he said softly. Miles allowed himself a faint smile, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in years. "I never was," he replied. And with that, he disappeared into the twilight, a ghost no longer hidden, but finally seen. Outside, the afternoon sun was softening, its golden light stretching long and lazy across the cracked pavement of the quiet town. People passed by without a glance, wrapped up in their own worlds, unaware that just moments ago, a silent reckoning had unfolded inside the small gun store. Miles Tannen stepped away from the door and made his way to a weathered wooden bench beneath a gnarled oak tree that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the sidewalk. This was his refuge, the one spot in town where the noise of the world dulled to a whisper and he could gather the fragments of himself in peace. With deliberate care, he lowered his battered canvas duffel bag to the ground. The worn fabric was coated in a fine layer of dust, collected during months spent wandering between shelters, parks, and forgotten corners. He reached inside and drew out a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and softened by years of use, the edges frayed from constant handling. He opened it gently, the pages yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. Each entry was a capsule of time. Short, precise notes detailing missions that the world would never know, names redacted, coordinates disguised with cryptic symbols. Yet beneath the cold, tactical language, there were glimpses of something raw and human, moments of loss, regret, hope, and a steady will to protect. His fingers paused over a page dated nearly 2 decades earlier. A single line had been underlined with a slightly trembling hand. "Protect the unseen. Fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. This mission is not just combat, it is honor." He let out a slow breath, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. This was not a diary of victories or medals. It was a ledger of duty carried in shadows. The tattoo on his arm, the suppressor resting inside his duffel, the precise steadiness in his hands, they were all reminders of a life lived beyond recognition, a life spent in service to causes too secret for headlines. But something had shifted today. The laughter and dismissal in the gun store had vanished, replaced by a quiet awakening of respect. The world, at least this small corner of it, had begun to see him for what he truly was. Miles closed the journal, fastening its worn strap. With one last glance at the fading light filtering through the leaves above, he slung the duffel over his shoulder and stood. He began to walk, each step measured but unburdened, moving toward the horizon as the town's evening hush grew around him. He was still a ghost, marked by scars and stories untold, but now he was a ghost finally recognized, a man no longer invisible. The evening air had cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant pine. Miles Tannen's footsteps echoed softly on the cracked sidewalk as he moved down the street, each step measured but relaxed. The sun was slipping behind the horizon, casting the town in a warm, fading glow, soft oranges bleeding into dusky purples. Ahead, a small cluster of people had gathered outside Marion's diner, neighbors swapping stories, laughter bubbling through the air like a familiar song. Children played nearby, their voices ringing out in carefree bursts, chasing shadows in the waning light. A dog barked somewhere off the side street. A car passed slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating the weathered signs on storefronts shuttered for the night. Miles stopped just out of sight behind a chipped lamppost, his eyes quietly observing the scene. There was no urgency in his gaze, no suspicion, only the calm vigilance born from decades of experience, a soldier's awareness tuned now to simple human moments. He watched the young couple leave the diner hand in hand, their easy smiles reflecting the hope and innocence of a life untouched by war's brutality. An elderly woman leaned on her cane, sharing a soft smile with a passing stranger. Nearby, a boy's bike slipped sideways on loose gravel, drawing a quick, delighted laugh. For a fleeting moment, Miles allowed himself to simply be part of it. Not the hidden operative, not the weathered veteran, but a man taking in the steady rhythm of everyday life. He breathed in the faint aroma of coffee and rain-soaked earth, letting the quiet comfort settle inside him. His mind wandered back to the gun store, to the subtle strength of the tattoo beneath his sleeve, the worn journal tucked inside his duffel bag, and the silent respect that had blossomed in the faces of those who had once laughed. That past, heavy and relentless, was no longer just a chain dragging behind him. It was a foundation beneath his feet, steady and sure. The world might still see him as a homeless ghost, a forgotten relic on the street, but within himself, Miles carried a quiet dignity, a presence forged in fire and silence, a truth no outsider could touch. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared and the sky deepened to twilight, Miles drew a slow, steady breath and stepped forward from the shadows, back into a life waiting silently for him, unspoken but undeniable. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The park was just beginning to stir to life, joggers passing by in quiet rhythm, parents pushing strollers along winding paths, and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the calm. Miles Tannen sat on a weathered wooden bench, his worn duffel bag resting at his feet. The bench, scarred by years of weather and use, had become a familiar refuge, a place to watch the world without being watched. His eyes followed a group of children chasing after a frisbee, their laughter light and carefree. He let the sounds wash over him, a small comfort amid the heavy memories that clung to him like a second skin. Then she appeared, a woman in her 40s, dressed simply in a soft sweater and jeans, approached with an easy confidence that didn't seek to invade but to connect. Her gaze met his directly, clear, kind, and without judgment. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice steady and warm. "I couldn't help but overhear you in the gun store yesterday." Miles looked up, his eyes narrowing for a moment as he assessed her intentions. There was no pity there, no challenge, just genuine curiosity. She smiled faintly and continued, "You have the bearing of someone who's seen a lot. I'm a social worker. I work with veterans. Sometimes it's hard to find the ones who don't want to be found." He studied her carefully, then nodded slowly. It's easier to disappear, he said, his voice low and deliberate. She shifted slightly, lowering her tone as if sharing a secret. But disappearing doesn't mean being invisible. Not to everyone. A faint smile crept onto his lips, the first small crack in a wall long built. Maybe not. She settled on the bench beside him, careful to respect his space but close enough to offer comfort. My name's Anna, she said gently. I'd like to help. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Just know that there are people who see you, who remember. Miles looked out over the park. Children playing tag, couples walking hand in hand, elderly men tossing crumbs to pigeons. A world so ordinary, yet somehow so distant from the life he'd known. I'm not sure I'm ready, he confessed quietly, voice barely above a whisper. But maybe I'm tired of running. Anna nodded, understanding. One step at a time. No pressure. For a moment, silence wrapped around them like a blanket. The city hummed softly, oblivious to the quiet exchange. Miles reached into his duffel, pulling out the leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. His fingers brushed over its cracked spine, tracing the worn edges with a tenderness that belied the hardened man. This is my story, he said softly, almost reverently. Not many get to read it. Anna's eyes softened. Maybe it's time someone did. The sunlight shifted, filtering through the branches above and casting dappled shadows across their faces. For the first time in a long while, Miles felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile thread connecting him back to the world he thought he'd lost. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start letting others see the man behind the ghost. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not empty. Miles Tannen moved through them like a shadow in the morning light, present but not fully seen. His routine remained the same. A bench in the park, a few steps around the neighborhood, and the occasional trip to the gun store. Yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. Anna's quiet offer of connection echoed in his mind. It was a fragile thread, one he was still hesitant to grasp, but it reminded him that even ghosts could be reached. One late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the rusted rooftops, Miles pushed open the door of Jackson County Firearms again. The bell overhead chimed softly, breaking the silence like a small announcement. The clerk glanced up from the register, eyes narrowing in surprise as he recognized the familiar figure. I wasn't sure you'd come back, the clerk said quietly, a tone somewhere between hesitation and hope. Miles met his gaze, steady and unflinching. There's still unfinished business, he replied, his voice calm but layered with meaning. From a side aisle, the contractor emerged from the back room, crossing his arms. His expression was measured, almost solemn. He's right, the man said quietly. There's a lot about him no one understands. The clerk swallowed hard and gestured toward the racks of rifles and gear behind the counter. What can I help you with? Miles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small, battered metal case. Opening it carefully, he revealed a set of dog tags, scratched, worn, edges smoothed by time and countless missions. The clerk's eyes widened as recognition flickered through his confusion. They're not from around here, he said softly. Miles gave a small shrug, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. No, they're from a place most people never hear about. The contractor stepped forward, voice low but steady. Miles isn't just any veteran. He's a man who carried secrets, missions, and burdens no one can imagine. The kind of soldier you don't see on the news, but whose actions save lives. The clerk nodded slowly, the weight of realization settling in. I'm sorry we doubted you. It was wrong. Miles inclined his head, expression serious but accepting. Respect isn't given lightly. It's earned, and sometimes forgotten. Before the conversation could continue, Anna appeared quietly in the doorway. Her presence was calm but resolute, a bridge between Miles and the world he'd spent so long avoiding. The clerk looked at her briefly, then back at Miles. If you ever need anything or someone to talk to, you know where to find me, he said sincerely. Miles met the clerk's eyes, a subtle nod conveying gratitude. He packed away his dog tags and closed the case gently before shouldering his duffel. As he turned to leave, the contractor spoke softly. You're not invisible here. Miles paused, looking back once, the fading light catching the sharp lines of his face. Maybe not anymore. Stepping outside, the evening air was cool and still. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving behind a soft glow on the horizon. For the first time in a long while, Miles felt the weight of his invisibility lifting, not because of medals or recognition, but because of the quiet acceptance of those who saw him for who he really was. He walked into the dusk, no longer a ghost lurking in the shadows, but a man quietly reclaiming his place in the world. The early morning light slipped softly through the thin curtains of the small room Miles now called home. It was a modest space inside a local shelter for veterans, simple, unadorned, but safe. The faded walls carried the faint scent of old paint and dust, and the worn mattress in the corner seemed to sigh under the weight of years. Above a rickety dresser hung a solitary photograph, yellowed with age and pinned with a crooked nail. It showed a group of young soldiers gathered around a campfire, faces glowing with camaraderie and hope. Miles reached out, fingers brushing the edges as if trying to grasp the warmth frozen in that moment. Today was different. This wasn't just another day of hiding in plain sight, wandering from place to place, or enduring the cold embrace of invisibility. Today was a day of quiet resolve. Anna's words from their last meeting echoed gently in his mind, one step at a time. Miles dressed carefully, each movement slow but purposeful, as if convincing himself this was more than just a routine ritual. He laced his worn boots tightly, feeling the familiar leather hug his feet, then slipped his leather-bound journal into the satchel slung over his shoulder. That journal, filled with faded ink, coded entries, and memories he had long buried, was his tether to a past he was now ready to face head-on. Downstairs, in the shelter's small common room, Anna waited. Her smile was steady and warm, carrying no judgment, only quiet assurance that he was not alone. "Ready?" she asked gently. Miles nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I think so." Together, they stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The city was stirring awake, the hum of cars, distant voices, and footsteps weaving into a steady rhythm. Yet amidst the bustling indifference, Miles felt the weight of years pressing down on him. The years of silence, loss, and survival. Their destination was a small community center, a humble gathering place where veterans came not for parades or medals, but for connection, stories, and healing. As they entered, the room quieted. Eyes turned toward Miles, some curious, others carrying their own stories of pain and endurance. Faces marked by hardship, resilience, and a shared understanding. Anna introduced him simply. "This is Miles. He's been through a lot, and he's choosing to be here." Miles took a seat among the circle, the murmur of voices fading into a comforting background. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly listen, to be part of something bigger than himself. The journey ahead would not be easy. The scars, both visible and hidden deep within, wouldn't fade overnight. But today marked the first step forward, not to erase the past, but to live with it, to carry it with strength, and to begin healing. The community center was filled with a quiet hum, the low murmur of voices sharing stories, offering advice, and exchanging moments of understanding. The veterans seated in a loose circle wore the marks of lives lived hard, weathered hands, tired eyes, and the invisible scars etched deep beneath the surface. Some laughed freely, while others nodded in solemn agreement or sat in reflective silence. This was a place where judgment was left at the door, replaced by a quiet strength born from shared experience. Miles Tannen sat among them, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze attentive. For so long, he had moved through the world as a ghost, unseen, unheard, and isolated by choice and circumstance. But here, surrounded by men and women who bore their own battles, he felt a subtle shift inside himself. He was not alone. As the stories unfolded, tales of hardship, resilience, loss, and sometimes victory, Miles absorbed each word with growing understanding. These voices, raw and honest, spoke of pain but also of healing. The shared moments were not just about past struggles, but about moving forward, about finding purpose beyond the battlefield. When it was his turn, Miles spoke sparingly. His voice was steady but quiet, carrying the weight of years without seeking sympathy or praise. He spoke of the loneliness, the hidden wounds, and the struggle to find a place in a world that had moved on without him. His words were met with nods, silent acknowledgement from those who understood more deeply than words could express. As the session drew to a close, Anna approached quietly, offering a small smile that carried warmth and encouragement. "You did well today," she said softly. Miles returned the smile, a faint but genuine curve of his lips. "One step at a time," he replied. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the quiet street. The warmth seeped into the cool air, touching the worn bricks of the buildings and the scattered leaves along the sidewalks. Miles stepped outside, feeling the subtle but profound shift within him. The weight in his chest was lighter now, less suffocating, more manageable. The ghost he had once been was fading, replaced by a man reclaiming his quiet strength. For the first time in many years, Miles allowed himself to hope, not for grand gestures or sudden redemption, but for the slow, steady healing that comes from connection, acceptance, and the courage to face another day. The evening had settled quietly over the small town, the fading light casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the cracked pavement. Inside the modest room Miles now called his own, silence reigned, thick, heavy, and yet oddly comforting. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and noise that had once defined his life. But even in this calm, shadows lingered, ghosts of missions long past, the faces of comrades lost, and secrets buried deep beneath layers of time and pain. Miles sat by the narrow window, the faint glow of street lamps flickering outside. He opened his worn leather-bound journal once more, its pages whispering stories of sacrifice, loyalty, and heartache. The ink was faded, the handwriting deliberate and precise. Yet beneath the surface of each entry lay the weight of a life spent in service to a cause most would never understand. His eyes settled on a passage dated years ago, during a covert operation known only by its code name, Phantom Echo. The words were few but carried the full weight of sorrow and honor. Lost brothers, silent battlefields. The cost never counted in medals. His fingers traced the words slowly, feeling the intangible heaviness of those memories pressing down upon him. The scars on his body, some faint, others stark, were constant reminders of battles fought in shadow. But the deepest wounds were invisible, etched into his very soul. The room was cold, but he hardly noticed. His mind drifted through the faces of friends who had vanished into silence, the betrayals that haunted him, and the years spent alone, fading from a world that had moved on. A soft, deliberate knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Miles looked up to see Anna standing quietly in the threshold, holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing a look of gentle understanding. "I thought you might want this," she said softly, stepping inside. He accepted the cup with a nod, a flicker of gratitude touching his eyes. It was more than just coffee. It was a gesture of connection, a lifeline reaching across the gulf of his isolation. They sat together in the dim, fading light, two souls bound by pain and resilience. No words were needed at first, just the shared quiet, an acknowledgement of the past, and a tentative hope for the future. In that fragile moment, Miles allowed himself to face the shadows not with anger or regret, but with the quiet strength that had carried him this far. The soft light of morning seeped through the thin curtains of Miles's small room, casting a gentle glow over the worn leather journal resting on the bedside table. The quiet from the night before lingered, a subtle echo in the spaces of his mind, reminding him that connection, even if fragile, was possible. The warmth of Anna's presence and the unspoken understanding they shared had left a trace, a quiet spark amid years of solitude. Miles moved deliberately as he dressed, the weight of his past still heavy, but somehow less suffocating than before. The scars, the memories, the loneliness, all remained, but they no longer felt like chains. Instead, they were part of a story he could begin to share, He laced his boots tightly, feeling the worn leather support his steps, and tucked his journal into his satchel, a talisman and a testament to the life he had led. Anna awaited him downstairs, a steady presence in a world that had long felt uncertain. Her smile was quiet, reassuring, a gentle invitation into the next chapter of his journey. Together, they walked through the streets toward the community center, a place where veterans gathered not for recognition or ceremony, but for shared stories, healing, and hope. Inside, the room buzzed softly with quiet conversation. Faces lined with years of struggle and resilience turned toward the new arrival. Some nodded in greeting, others offered tentative smiles. The air was thick with unspoken understanding, a shared history woven through each individual. Miles took his seat among the circle, feeling the eyes of others, some familiar, others strangers, upon him. The hum of voices settled into a comforting background as he listened, absorbing the raw honesty that filled the room. Here, pain was acknowledged, not hidden. Vulnerability was strength, not weakness. When his turn came, Miles spoke softly but with purpose. His words were measured, revealing just enough of his story, the loneliness that had wrapped around him, the secret missions and lost brothers, the scars unseen but deeply felt. He did not seek sympathy or applause. Instead, he offered a piece of himself to the room, trusting that it would be met with understanding. Nods and gentle murmurs of encouragement met his honesty. Stories of similar loss and resilience echoed back, weaving a tapestry of shared experience. There was no rush, no judgment, just the slow, steady progress of healing, one small step at a time. Anna watched from the edge of the circle, pride shining quietly in her eyes. Miles's walls, built high over years of survival, had begun to crack, not with force, but with trust. Outside, the city moved on in its usual rhythm, oblivious to the profound shifts unfolding within the community center's walls. Miles left with a lighter step, the burden of invisibility lifted just enough to glimpse a path forward. The road ahead was uncertain, marked by challenges yet unseen. But for the first time in a long while, Miles walked it not as a ghost, but as a man reclaiming his strength and his future. The days following the group therapy sessions unfolded in a quiet rhythm, marked by small but significant shifts. For the first time in years, Miles felt a restless energy beneath the calm, a cautious hope stirring beneath layers of guarded silence. Each morning, he rose with a bit more purpose, carrying the weight of his past with slightly less burden. One warm afternoon, he found himself wandering through the park, the familiar path lined with towering oaks and benches weathered by time. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the cracked pavement. The world was moving around him, the laughter of children mingling with the distant hum of traffic. He paused by a bench tucked beneath a sprawling oak tree, a place he had passed countless times before but had never truly seen. Something about the bench felt different that day, almost like an invitation. Without thinking, Miles sat down, the worn leather of his duffel bag brushing against the rough wood. He reached inside and pulled out the leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. The journal was a constant companion, its pages a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was slowly becoming. Flipping through the pages, he paused at one marked with a folded corner, a letter he had written years ago to a fallen comrade. It was a letter never sent, words penned in the quiet aftermath of loss and regret, but never forgotten. I carry your memory in every step. Your sacrifice is not in vain. One day, we will meet again in a place of peace. The words struck a chord deep within him. He traced the ink with a fingertip, feeling the weight of sorrow and love intertwined on the fragile paper. Closing the journal gently, he pressed his palm to its worn leather cover, as if sealing a silent promise, not just to his lost brother in arms, but to himself. Nearby, a young boy kicked a soccer ball past the bench, his laughter ringing out clear and bright against the gentle rustle of leaves. Miles allowed himself a brief moment to watch without the familiar heaviness settling in. The boy's carefree joy was a stark contrast to the battles and burdens that had shaped his own life. Yet, in that contrast, there was a fragile beauty. The future stretched out before him, uncertain, fragile, and vast. But for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a chasm. Instead, it was a path he could walk, step by deliberate step. Rising slowly, Miles felt the afternoon sun warm his face as it dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows behind him. The scars he carried, visible and invisible, reminded him of the steep road still ahead. Yet, within that quiet moment, a promise took root in his heart. A promise of healing, of resilience, and of the strength to face whatever lay beyond the next dawn. With the journal tucked back into his bag, he walked forward beneath the old oak's sprawling branches, a man no longer defined by the shadows of his past, but by the quiet hope that guided him into the future. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. Miles stood outside the shelter, the familiar weight of his leather-bound journal strapped securely inside his bag. It was more than just a book. It was a testament to his journey, a chronicle of battles fought both on distant battlefields and within himself. The path he had walked was long and rugged, but here, in this small town that bustled quietly around him, his journey was reaching a new horizon. The streets hummed with ordinary life. A mother pushing a stroller, a group of teenagers laughing on their way to school, and shopkeepers opening their doors. None of them knew the stories etched into the man who now walked among them with steady steps and a calm presence. The invisible scars he carried were no longer hidden beneath the weight of invisibility, but carried with a quiet dignity that demanded respect, even if unspoken. Miles walked toward the community center, the place where he had once hesitated to step inside but now entered with a steady heart. The familiar faces greeted him with nods, small smiles, and gentle eyes that spoke volumes of shared understanding and silent encouragement. These were people who had seen struggle, loss, and pain, yet also strength, resilience, and hope reborn. He took his place in the circle, settling into the rhythm of the group. The atmosphere was thick with emotion, but it was different today, lighter somehow, filled with a sense of progress and quiet celebration. The stories shared weren't just about wounds and trauma anymore. They were about survival, about finding meaning beyond pain, and about slowly reclaiming life on one's own terms. When his turn came, Miles spoke with a soft confidence that surprised even himself. His words were measured but carried the full weight of experience. He spoke of loss, the brothers he had lost, the battles fought in silence, and the loneliness that had shadowed him for years. But he also spoke of healing, the small victories, the moments of connection, and the fragile hope that had begun to take root. His voice never rose, yet it filled the room with an undeniable power, the power of truth, presence, and resilience. The circle listened intently, their support an unspoken balm that soothed wounds both fresh and old. As the session drew to a close, Anna approached him quietly, her eyes shining with pride and warmth. "You've come a long way," she said simply. Miles met her gaze and nodded, the quiet strength in his eyes reflecting the journey that had transformed him. "One step at a time," he replied, his voice steady and sure. Stepping outside, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, bathing the world in a warm, golden light. The shadows of yesterday felt distant, replaced by the promise of a new day. Miles breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. He was no longer the forgotten veteran, no longer the man who vanished into the background, weighed down by invisible burdens. He was a man reclaimed, by his own truth, by the presence he carried, and by the quiet victory of resilience and dignity. And as the town bustled around him, Miles walked on, into the light, into life, and into a future still uncertain but finally embraced. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.